So the threshold when you're talking about human trafficking cannot be, is this legal? Because it's in many cases not. And the issue isn't legal compliance. The issue is moral and ethical compliance. So I would suggest that we get rid of that context in terms of this area particularly, and no longer start using, is it law? Is it legal? A question.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hi, everyone. This is your host, Gwen Hassan, with the Hidden Traffic podcast. For a different kind of episode today, we're not going to have a guest. I have myself as a guest today. I've been keeping notes for a while now on new things I've found, developments, news in the area of human trafficking and forced labor prevention. And I thought this would be a good opportunity during a little bit of a summer lull to cover some of these things and bring you up to speed and give you kind of a snapshot of what I see coming in terms of human trafficking prevention and where the podcast will head over the next few months as we come into the final stretch of 2022. So first of all, as evidenced by the podcast, there has been a flurry of activity around the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I'm really finding that it is driving broader conversations amongst companies that I'm familiar with, some that I'm working with, about their supply chains. This has really served as an impetus for kind of an examination of, hey, where do we get our goods from? Are we sure that the supply chain is clean? Do we feel like we have mapped out our full chain of supply to a place that we're comfortable with so we could defend a case if we ended up, having a seizure of goods under the UFLPA. So I'm excited to see this kind of work. I know of a couple of companies who are truly domestic only companies, ones that don't manufacture anything overseas, that only sell here in the United States, that have nevertheless now started full-scale risk assessment processes for forced labor risk within their supply chain. And it really has stemmed from that UFLPA work because many of them are concerned they may have private label goods that are manufactured for them under a contract manufacturing arrangement overseas. Some are just importers of record on goods that they then distribute to locations throughout the United States. And they've become really aware of the fact that they may be caught up in a forced labor situation, even if it's not their own labor or their own manufacturing. So I'm happy to see that this is developing. And I think there'll be more of this coming, especially in light of kind of the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is this German Human Rights Due Diligence Act that has come into, it's been passed, so it'll come into force at the end of this year. It is going to require any employer who has operations with a nexus to Germany have a full-scale human rights due diligence program for their supply chain. So again, mapping of the supply chain, but then specific look at human rights factors like forced labor, obviously human trafficking, but child labor as well, fair treatment and safety. There's a whole laundry list. I am in the process of scheduling someone to come in and be a guest on the podcast to talk about that in the fall. So we'll have somebody soon, I hope, who can give us even more detail about what will be required under that act for those of you who may have connections to Germany. But I'm also here to tell you that Germany is no longer the only game in town. Earlier this year in the spring, Japan announced that it is also now going to launch a human rights due diligence requirement for all companies that have a nexus with business in Japan. Don't have details yet on what that law will look like, but it is in the planning stages now. And I would expect that we'll have further guidance on it within the next few months. So I'm beginning to see the push of the initial domino here We're building momentum. UFLPA, German Human Rights Act, Japanese Human Rights Diligence Act, all of these are starting to point towards a real movement of regulators looking at and requiring companies to have full supply chain maps and to have conducted diligence on that supply chain back to source on, no longer just the financial risk and the corruption risk, but a broader human rights focus as well. So again, I'll try and find someone who can be a guest on the podcast to talk to us about the Japanese Act as well. We'll look forward to that in the fall too. I guess the overall message here for you all is, if you're not yet convinced that now is the time to map out your supply chain and get a due diligence process in place that takes into account human rights risks, then it should be. Now is the time. Get ahead of it before you're caught kind of flat-footed on this. Next thing I wanted to talk about, I am seeing a number of companies that are altering and expanding their codes of conduct, even those that are typically domestic companies, to include reference to human rights issues, and more specifically to forced labor and human trafficking issues. This has been fairly common, I would say, for a few years in multinational companies. Those that are working with connections to Europe and Southeast Asia have for quite a while now had this kind of language in their codes of conduct. However, I have worked with and known a few companies that are primarily domestic operating companies that have thought, well, we don't really have that risk. That isn't a risk for us. And I think they're starting to see that because their supply chain is truly international and they are importing goods from other places, that they do have that risk. And they're adding it to their ESG programs as part of their social governance pillar. And they're starting to modify their policies and their codes of conduct to reflect their company stance on working to eradicate any kind of human trafficking or forced labor or illegal child labor from their supply chain. I have an episode coming up in a couple of weeks now that will talk specifically about some resources related to that and how companies can think about, or ways to think about, their impact on human rights in the context of when they discover that there might be a human rights issue. Do they pull up and leave a location or a division or a segment of a country or a country entirely? Or are there other options that companies can use to make a difference in that space? So watch for that episode coming soon. I'm turning now to kind of more practical information. People ask me frequently when I talk to them, hey, I want to make a difference here. I don't know what to do. Is there something I can do on a personal level? Yeah, I know you talk about using my company resources and changing my company compliance program and doing a company risk assessment. And yes, I'm working on those things, but I personally want to do something. What can I do? Well, there's lots of options. Donating and supporting financially different organizations that are working to eradicate forced labor and child labor and human trafficking, always a good option. But I thought I'd throw out a couple of novel ideas for you today in case you're looking for other ways to make a difference here. There is an app that is dedicated to helping stop human trafficking. It is called Traffic Cam, and that is spelled TRAFFICK, capital CAM, no space. You can download it if you're on an Apple device from the Apple Store. And it is an app that asks people as they travel, and people are starting to return to traveling now in the ongoing saga of COVID. We're starting to see people at least mask up and go travel. They're asking people to take photos of hotel rooms when they travel. And the app walks them through the different angles of pictures that they want, what they want to capture within the picture, and allows you to submit directly through the app. Why? Why would that be of any assistance? Well, because so often, especially here in the United States, the end result of trafficking might be a group of people that are living 10 people to a hotel room, sleeping on the floors, and it's usually a cheap, not great hotel room, and then being farmed out for labor, whether it's agricultural labor, whether it's maid or custodial services. So they might be housed in a cheap row motel, many, many dozens of people in a room where it becomes impossible to figure out where people are being housed. So the other but the other thing that happens is if people are trafficked for sexual purposes, they are often held captive in a hotel room, and then they're advertised for sale on a Craigslist listing or a dark web listing that will often show a picture of them in the room, often on a bed, inviting people to buy their services as they're being trafficked. So the object of this Traffic Cam app is to literally create, in conjunction with law enforcement, a database of the different characteristics of different hotel rooms. And it links to a GPS that shows where that hotel is. So they could do a match. If there's a listing on a Craigslist site for a woman up for sexual services, they can match that photo electronically using AI with the photos submitted by the app users to figure out, oh, this carpet pattern appears in this brand of hotels, and this particular curtain color has been linked to the hotel located at this address, and can literally help law enforcement figure out where people are being held. So for an easy feel-good way to at least try and make some dent, I suggest downloading that app and using it as you travel, both personally and for business. The other one is I recently stumbled across a great group. It's a not-for-profit called Truckers Against Trafficking. And as you are no doubt aware, when you're moving people, whether it's an individual, whether it's a couple dozen people who are coming in to the country being trafficked in to do agricultural work, or, as I said, custodial work, or for that matter, sex trafficking work, oftentimes they are moved, most often, by truck, by some kind of vehicle. And the network of over-the-road truckers, especially in North America, is huge. And there's actually significant numbers of them in Europe as well. But the network that they form and the friendships that they form on the road can really be an asset to law enforcement in helping to identify potential victims of trafficking. So they too have created their own app, and it will help the different truckers that are on the road on identifying potential victims of trafficking, but also reporting them directly. And it's all done right through the app based on the encounters that they have on their road and their jobs. So for any of you who are or have friends or relatives who may be involved in the trucking industry, I commend you to check out Truckers Against Trafficking. They have a website, and information about their app can be found there. I want to pivot now to a soapbox that I'm fond of, but I haven't really talked about on the podcast yet, which is the link between corporate culture and fighting of human trafficking. I would argue that many corporate cultures, kind of old school corporate cultures, are using a command and control type of approach to running their business. And by that, I mean, there are bosses who assert authority and give direction and demand allegiance. And there's this kind of I know better than you, so you should follow what I say sort of a mentality. There's I lead, you follow. There's a lot of assignment of projects. Here, you do this and get it back to me by now. There's a tendency for a closed information loop where the bosses are in a senior management group and they become a bit like an echo chamber. They tell each other the same things. They reaffirm each other's opinions. There's a lack of diversity of thought, and they get into a cycle where they're not making great decisions, or they're making decisions that aren't aligned well with the stated values of the company, or for that matter, the stated values of their employees. And I think we're seeing more and more evidence of this in what is being termed the Great Resignation, but I think is also now being referred to as the Great Reshuffle, which I think is more accurate. The idea that employees are saying, enough with this. I don't want to work for a company where I don't see myself reflected, where my values don't matter. So I'm voting with my feet and I'm leaving, and I'm going to go work for a different employer that better encapsulates what I believe to be good and true. So those kinds of cultures, I would argue, are also the kinds of cultures that are most often likely to foster the kind of environments where the demand for human trafficking is supported and furthered, most often inadvertently, but often the case. And I'll give you an example. Without naming names, I have done some work for a company in the past where they were primarily a North American based operation, no kind of sales outside of North America, and very limited in terms of employees anywhere outside of the United States. They had a smattering of people that might have been in Canada or half a dozen that might have been in Mexico, but for the most part, people were in the United States. And during a conversation, we talked about whether or not we needed to identify as a risk of human trafficking. And the resulting conversation from this group, and it was a senior management group, was, we don't have any human trafficking risk. What are you talking about? That's ridiculous. No one's ever heard of that. We're a domestic company. Don't try and complicate things. We're not a large multinational, Gwen. Why would we even waste our time on that? There's no return on investment in looking at that. That's not a risk. It's not a true risk for us. Let it go. And was very, very closed loop. That same company, who I will not identify, ended up embroiled in a human trafficking issue related to Southeast Asia that they were entirely blind to the possibility of because they didn't have the kind of culture that supported diversity of thought and challenge. The leader culture, which I like far better, is the idea of leaders being somebody who have influence, but gain that influence through trust and through mentorship and through education. They're there to inspire and to guide, not to dictate and exercise authority over. These kinds of cultures are far better at creating a sense of belonging and a sense of psychological safety that lends itself then to people being able to speak up and to feel safe. They feel safe saying, I don't know. They feel safe saying, I made a mistake or I disagree with you. They have the safety to say, hey, I have a concern, to admit that they might be wrong, or to say, hey, I have an idea. I have a thought here. And when that kind of safety exists, you've got then the latitude of leaders in that organization to do, I'm borrowing a term I heard came out of the Netflix organization, which I love, called farming for dissent, which is when you're going to make a decision or a suggestion, you purposely pause and ask people, hey, what's wrong with this idea? What haven't I thought of? What am I unaware of here? What should I be further educated about before we make this decision? Do you disagree with this decision and why? And be able to hold space as a manager, as a leader, for the kind of uncomfortable emotions that might arise with being vulnerable like that, and allowing somebody to say, yeah, I disagree with you, or I think you're wrong here. And being able to have those conversations is what will far more likely lead to the prevention of human trafficking and forced labor, because people who are in the operation can then feel safe enough to raise their hand and say, hey, I think we might have an issue here. Has anybody looked at the fact that we're paying this guy in Southeast Asia a recruiting fee to bring in employees for us? Hey, I got a call from someone complaining that, the local office was holding everyone's passports. I'm not sure what to do about this. So when you've got that kind of culture, I think you're far more likely to be successful in making a dent in human trafficking and forced labor prevention efforts. So that's my long way of saying, I think as much as we talk about here on the podcast, legislation that needs to be taken into account, risk assessments that you can use, ways to approach mitigating risk, please don't forget that I think probably the biggest part of making a dent in this huge issue is a focus on culture and making sure that your company's corporate culture supports the kind of environment where these issues can be surfaced safely and where there's a diversity of thought and opinion that will lead to real solutions instead of just denial. I also want to talk a little bit about the idea of decision trees. And so often we see in corporate compliance materials tools that are provided to employees about ethical decision making. And there's kind of these famous or infamous now screens that are used, things like, is this something you'd feel comfortable published on the front page of the newspaper? If not, it's probably not an ethical decision. Of course, forgetting the fact that there's multiple now generations of people who don't read newspapers anymore. They get all of their news from TikTok and and social media sites. But be that as it may, there's these different tests, ethical tests that are often raised for this discussion. And I've seen repeatedly throughout my career, kind of the first thing that people ask is it legal? And that question is supposed to drive a better and more ethical decision, right? Because people say, oh, well, that's the first threshold. That should be the question here. Is it legal or not? Because if it's not legal, then you stop. And if it's legal, then maybe you ask yourself about the front page question, or you ask yourself if you'd be comfortable telling your family and friends about this decision. But that gateway question is the legal question. I'd like to suggest that, especially in the context of human trafficking and forced labor, that's the wrong question to ask, because is it legal will never answer for you in places where there are no laws against human trafficking, or where there are no laws against forced labor, or where there are laws specifically permitting things like genital mutilation and the forced marriage of children. So the threshold when you're talking about human trafficking cannot be, is this legal? Because it's in many cases not. And the issue isn't legal compliance. The issue is moral and ethical compliance. So I would suggest that we get rid of that context in terms of this area particularly, and no longer start using, is it law? Is it legal? A question. And I don't want you to get the idea that I'm talking only about foreign locations, Southeast Asia or South America or, Eastern Europe. These same types of is it legal questions happen right here in the United States. In case you weren't already aware, there are 12 states here in the United States that have no minimum age of marriage. So anyone of any age can be married. Consider for a moment that you're a law firm or, a consulting services firm, and you provide immigration services as part of that. And you have a client who comes in who says, hey, I need a fiancé visa for this young woman. She's 14 years old and she's moving here to the United States from, fill in the blank. And it's a fiancé visa because we're going to get married. And the person requesting it is a 40-year-old man. Is that legal? Depending on if he lives in one of these 12 states, it is perfectly legal for him to marry a 14-year-old. And I would argue that no 14-year-old girl would ever willingly, without force and coercion, marry a 40-year-old man. So it becomes a way, and a trafficked way, of bringing women in to the United States for purposes of trafficking them. Because if you can bring them in under a fiancé visa, you can marry them, and then you control them, and you can farm them out for work, sexual or otherwise, within the United States. So overall message here, don't rely on is it legal as an initial kind of threshold evaluation when it comes to human trafficking, forced labor, child labor issues. Last thing, I have a resource suggestion for everyone. I get questions all the time from people who are feeling overwhelmed and saying, Gwen, I don't know where to start in creating a compliance program as it relates to human trafficking. How do I do a risk assessment? What are the factors I should be looking for? Gosh, I don't even know where to start. I always refer them to the International Labor Organization's kind of risk factors for human trafficking, to the Trafficking in Persons report, which the State Department puts out every year. But I recently came across a recently published, I think it was in May, guide that is entitled Scaling ESG Solutions in Fashion. And it sounds like it wouldn't have much to do with human trafficking and forced labor, but it actually does. It was produced by a combination of Accenture, but also Women's Wear Daily, the Responsible Business Coalition at Fordham University, and the Gabelli School of Business, and a group called Fashion Makes Change. These organizations grouped together to kind of talk about the problem of fast fashion and how to develop an ESG program that works within the context of the fashion industry. And in the process, created a really nice resource guide that talks about kind of the steps you take and how you scale it, where you begin, what a program that takes into account human trafficking issues looks like. Because, of course, human trafficking, especially as it relates to cotton, and the cotton industry and the garment industry is of very high risk for that industry. So it won't apply to everything in your industry if you're not in fashion, but it gives a really nice outline. So Google it. Literally Google scaling ESG solutions in fashion, and it will pull up this really nice multi-page colored report that outlines in some really clear steps where to start and kind of what to consider and factors you should be thinking about. So that wraps up this solo episode of Hidden Traffic. Thank you for listening. And stay tuned. As I mentioned, I'm working on a few new recordings. I'm recording one next week, a new episode. So more to come on all of these issues as we go forward. But now you're caught up on all the current developments that I've been keeping track of for a while. So thank you. I look forward to talking to you again soon.